The clock strikes midnight, March 19th, 1919, in New Orleans, Louisiana. One would expect, on this day and time, for most residents to be asleep in their beds, especially outside of the busier city thoroughfares. But that is not the case on this particular night. Instead, walking down a would-be quiet street, you'd find lights on in each home. And what's more, you'd notice the sounds of jazz music drifting out into the street, a discordant cacophony of noise issuing from each and every house. Others would leave their homes and cram into jazz clubs across the city. Few would sleep, and while some would try to make a fun evening out of it, the night we all stayed up and listened to jazz, most would be terrified. Because while you might easily mistake such a night as a celebration of sorts, this one was far from it. This was a night of terror, a night New Orleans residents would do anything to avoid being the notorious Axeman's next victim. But who was the Axeman, and why jazz music? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm Shay LaFontaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. It's Spooktober! Yay! Spooktober is my favorite time of year on History Fix because I have so many spooky stories that I want to tell, and I mostly try to save them for this month. So I'm super excited to finally get to some of these spooky stories. Quick announcement before we get into the story today. Some of you may have already noticed if you're subscribed to my YouTube channel or my Patreon, but I have once again completely lost my mind, officially this time, and started working on a kid version of the podcast that I'm calling History Fix Kids. It is video only at the moment, and it's also only on YouTube and Patreon right now. I'll probably add it to Spotify too at some point. It's kind of in like an experimental phase right now. I only have a few episodes out. But if you have kids or you're an educator, check it out. I think you're really going to like it. Now, that doesn't change anything for regular History Fix listeners. This show will go on as usual. History Fix Kids is sort of its own separate, but obviously related thing. And I'm super excited about it. There were a few different interactions that I had with people, with History Fix listeners, actually, that prompted it. History Fix has a lot of young listeners, and I love that. I love you guys. But I started to see a need for, and a demand for, really, a version of the show geared specifically toward children. And it feels like coming home, really, because it blends the two halves of what I do, the podcast and education, creating educational resources, which is my actual job. It blends them together in this really beautiful way. So anyway, I'm obviously very excited about it. History Fix Kids, just getting started. Much more to come on that. Speaking of kids, though, this episode may not be the best one to listen to with your kids because it's pretty violent and gruesome. We're talking about a serial killer here. But it makes for a great story to kick off Spooktober. So let's get into it. You may be familiar with the Axeman of New Orleans from season 3 of American Horror Story. That show is fantastic at absolutely shattering everyone's understanding of history. So many misconceptions have come from that show, but it's not really their fault. It's a fictional show. Don't watch a fictional show and expect to learn historical facts. We got to be better about separating fact from fiction. So please don't believe anything that you saw in American Horror Story. It's fiction. Now, there was an Axeman of New Orleans serial killer, and jazz music was involved. That night of jazz actually happened that they depict in the show. But it's not exactly what people think. Okay, we're going to clear that up a little later in the story. So let's go back to the very beginning, of course. At the time, okay, it was believed that the Axeman's first attack happened in 1917. All right, that's like, and even some even say spring of 1918, just sort of depending on who you ask. But historian Miriam Davis thinks that that is dead wrong. Davis wrote the book about the Axeman called The Axeman of New Orleans, The True Story. So if you want to know more after listening to this episode, definitely check out that book. It's linked in the description. Davis thinks that the serial killer we call the Axeman actually started attacking people back in 1910, except that he went by a different name back then, or like people called him a different name. This wasn't like a name he came up with. The attacks that happened back in 1910 were attributed to a man they called the Cleaver. And then they stopped for years, and then they started back up again in 1917 or something, 1918, as the Axeman. But there are enough similarities between the Cleaver's attacks in 1910 and the Axeman's attacks in 1917, 1918, that a lot of experts like Davis are convinced that they are the same guy. And I totally agree. For one, they all happened in New Orleans, right? Two, they were all perpetrated with a similar weapon, a meat cleaver or meat axe in the case of the Cleaver, and a hatchet or axe in the case of the Axeman. For all of the attacks, the weapon was found on the victim's property or nearby. The killer didn't bring it with him. He found it when he got there or on his way there. And this is the real kicker, both the Cleaver and the Axeman attacked strictly Italian grocers. Yes, specifically Italian people who owned or ran or were associated with grocery stores. We'll talk more about that soon. The main reason the two weren't connected was because there was a 6-year gap of no attacks between the Cleaver and the Axeman. And some theorize that the Cleaver may have been in jail during this time period for some other petty crime and unable to keep attacking. But it led to that gap in time led to this disconnect where two different serial killers emerged, the Cleaver and the Axeman, who were most likely just the same person. So let's go back to the 1910 attacks by the Cleaver, who is very likely actually just the Axeman. And another thing that sort of convinces me of that is that we see an escalation happening. If you know anything about serial killers, you know their crimes tend to escalate. The first time they attack, it's a lot more tame and I guess you could even say hesitant. And then as they go, it becomes more and more violent and extreme as they gain confidence in what they're doing. So the very first attack by the Cleaver in 1910 is the most tame. He's just testing the waters. His first victims were an Italian couple who owned a grocery store named Harriet and August Cruti. On August 13th, 1910, Harriet awoke in the middle of the night to a man standing over her bed holding a meat cleaver, which is like a butcher knife, right? It has the big rectangular blade. It's for chopping through bones and whatnot when you're processing meat. This man is hovering over her holding a meat cleaver, and he tells her to give him all the money they have or he will chop her as he has chopped her husband. So she gives him $8, which I guess is all they had. That's a lot more considerable of amount back then, though. You have to keep in mind, $8 in 1910 was worth $34 today, but that had way more purchasing power. $34, aka $8, would buy you a lot back then, a lot more than you could buy with it now. So it isn't pennies, but it isn't a fortune either, right? Anyway, the guy gets away with the $8, and he also steals the couple's pet mockingbird for whatever reason. He had removed a pane of glass from the kitchen door, apparently trying to unlock the deadbolt, but when he was unable to reach the lock that way, he just pried the door open with a railroad pin. And this was a common thing that burglars did, leading police to believe that this guy was a burglar, right? He was used to breaking into houses. This whole railroad pin thing was a thing. Now, you will be glad to know, though, that despite sustaining injuries from the meat cleaver, August Cruti made a full recovery not long after. So we see some rookie moves here. He clearly isn't confident about how to get in the door. The removing the pane of glass plan fails. He has to come up with a second idea with the railroad pen. Also, August Cruty recovered pretty quickly, so he's clearly at least a little hesitant with his weapon. This isn't a particularly brutal attack, and he takes money and a bird. So he's like a little bit confused about what his motives are right now. Is he a burglar or a murderer, bird kidnapper? Like, what exactly is he doing here? He hasn't really fleshed that out yet. But we see some escalation with the next attack. Not much, a little bit. A little over a month later, on September 20th, 1910, Conchetta and Joseph Rosetto are attacked in their bed by a man wielding a stolen meat axe. The man had climbed through an unlocked kitchen window, and he didn't steal anything this time. He actually left $23 in the grocery store cash register. Because these were grocery stores where the people also lived. They had like living quarters in the back part of the grocery store or whatever. So it's their house, but it's also their store. He climbs in the window, doesn't touch the cash register, goes straight to the bedroom and attacks the Rosettos and then leaves. So the motive is developing. I mean, he's decided in this case that he's a murderer, not a burglar. He's here for blood, not money, this time anyway. But he doesn't actually kill anyone. Both Conchetta and Joseph Rosetto survived the attack, although Conchetta was left permanently disfigured and Joseph was blinded in one eye. Almost a year goes by before his next attack in the summer of 1911, and this would be his first actual murder that we know of. So far, everyone has survived the attacks. Not this one. Clear escalation here. The victims were newlyweds Joseph Davy and his 16-year-old, very pregnant wife, Mary. Like the others, Joseph and Mary Davy were Italian, and they ran a grocery store where they also lived. So Mary is awakened in the night by a man standing over her, right? Sounds familiar. She tries to wake up her husband, who is laying next to her, but doesn't realize that he's already been attacked. He was attacked in his sleep, didn't even have a chance to react. He had a loaded revolver actually ready beside the bed that was untouched. But so Mary tries to wake him. He's not waking up. The man tells Mary to hand over all their money, but she doesn't immediately respond. She's just in shock. She can't even speak. She's like frozen. So he hits her in the head with a mug, knocking her unconscious. What's interesting, though, is he asked her for money, and he seems to have rifled through their things, but he doesn't actually take anything. He leaves jewelry and cash behind. Mary survived, but Joseph succumbed to his injuries and died at the hospital about a day after the attack. It was determined that the cleaver, as he starts to be called, had once again come in through the window, and he had also avoided this sort of makeshift security alarm that Joseph had set up. So this is important, I think. Joseph Davy had set up this makeshift security alarm by hanging seltzer cans in their bedroom doorway. And he had hoped that these would make enough noise to wake him up if there was an intruder coming through that doorway. And then he had that loaded gun right next to his bed. So he was obviously preparing for some kind of intruder. Now, this wasn't during a string of attacks like what would come later where everyone's worried about this guy. It was only the third attack, and it had been almost a year since the last one. So what was Joseph Davy so worried about? This led to a theory that emerged that the cleaver was part of an Italian mafia group known as the Black Hand Society. Except that the Black Hand Society wasn't an actual mafia group. It was more of an extortion tactic, like a common scam that was being used at the time within the Italian community. So it's all different people. It's not like this organized group. And this, you have to understand, this is a very Italian thing, this organized crime mafia, specifically Sicilian. According to Davis, 80% of the Italian immigrants living in New Orleans were from Sicily. And the mafia was definitely a Sicilian thing. They just handled things differently there, culturally. This was like a cultural difference. They didn't go to the police. They handled things the old-fashioned way by carrying out vendettas. If someone wrongs you, you don't take them to court. You just go personally take care of it, right? You go take them out. But the mafia isn't really what people think. Historian Robert M. Lombardo says in a Smithsonian Magazine article written by Miriam Davis, quote, "The mafia was not a secret criminal organization, but a form of social organization that developed in Sicily and in the south of Italy under very specific circumstances. It was a form of behavior and a kind of power, not a formal organization," end quote. So this Black Hand Society, it was a type of Italian mafia activity going on in New Orleans among the Italian immigrant population at the time. They would send a letter to whoever they were trying to extort, demanding money, and then they would threaten them if they didn't give them the money. So Joseph Davi had actually received no less than 3 of these Black Hand letters demanding $200 from him that he had been ignoring, which explains the seltzer can security system and the revolver by the bed. Someone had been threatening him for money. But this was an Italian thing, the Black Hand Society. And Mary Davi, Joseph's pregnant wife who survived, she swore that the cleaver, the murderer, was a white man who spoke unaccented English. He wasn't an Italian immigrant. Also, he didn't take any money, right? He left cash behind. And the whole point of the Black Hand scheme was to get money. It was an extortion plot. Also, the fact that Mary Davi's life was spared does not fit with the MO of the Black Hand Society. They didn't tend to leave any survivors. They questioned a farmer named Sam Pizzo, who had been seen arguing with Joseph Davi in his store right before the murder, and who had threatened to kill his neighbor, who was also an Italian grocer. But Pizzo was very Italian, with a mustache, and Mary maintained that the murderer had been a clean-shaven white man. So they let Pizzo go. After Joseph Davi's death, this third attack by the cleaver, there were no more attacks until December of 1917, when they start back up. And when they start back up, the cleaver becomes the Axeman. So there's this disconnect because so much time has passed, but most people who know anything about this case believe that they're the same person, right? So December 1917, Italian grocers Epifanio and Anna Andalina are asleep in their bed. Once again, Anna is awakened by a shadowy figure standing over her husband holding a hatchet. So the meat cleaver has turned into a hatchet or an axe. It's an escalation, and it's also part of what transforms the cleaver into the Axeman. Alexandra Kennan Shahin writes in an article for Country Roads magazine, which I have heavily sourced for this episode, linked in the description, of course, quote, "After telling the woman to shut up and pointing a revolver at her, the man proceeded to bring the hatchet down on Epifanio in several strong blows. On his way out, as Anna screamed, the intruder passed through the room of the couple's 2 young sons, where he hit one in the head with the hatchet and knocked the other in the arm with the butt of his gun. This time, the assailant had carved a panel out of the back wooden door to enter, and he stole nothing. The family had never received threatening messages from the Black Hand, despite the police's inquiries. Epifanio died 10 months later in the Spanish influenza epidemic. His health no doubt weakened from the attack. His assailant still at large," end quote. So he doesn't actually kill anyone in this attack. He injures Epifanio, but he obviously recovers enough to survive for 10 more months and then die of the Spanish flu. He hits the boys on his way out, but clearly not intending to kill them, and he doesn't take anything. So it's like this escalation, but also de-escalation happening here, which makes sense considering he's been out of the game for 6 years. Now, to me, it's pretty obvious that this is just the cleaver again, and I'd probably be looking at records of who in the area maybe went to jail back in 1911 and just got out. But something happens that totally derails the investigation and prevents this connection from being made at the time. The main investigator of the Cleaver cases, Superintendent Reynolds of the New Orleans Police Department, was murdered in 1917. The police department has to get a new superintendent. They are sort of starting from scratch. No one sees the full picture like Reynolds had, and so they just don't make the connection. On May 23rd, 1918, this guy really ramps it up. This is the first in the string of attacks most often attributed to the Axeman. On this night, Joseph and Catherine Maggio were attacked and killed while they slept in their bedroom behind their grocery store. The killer had used a chisel to remove a panel of the wooden door and had taken an axe from the couple's backyard. And at first I was like, how is this guy managing to find axes at all of these houses just like laying around? I don't even own an axe. But you have to remember, this is 1918, right? They likely don't have heat in their houses. They might even be using a fire to cook at this point still. They probably have fireplaces, which means that they have to chop wood, which means that they have axes laying around near wood piles and whatnot. So axes were probably a lot more available back then than they might be now. So he took the axe from their backyard, killed them with it, and then left it in their bathtub covered in blood. A bloody straight razor was also found on the neighbor's lawn, which was believed to have been used in the murders as well, and then ditched afterwards. I don't know if he found this, maybe he found this in the bathroom when he was putting the axe in the bathtub and then went back with it to make sure that they were dead. I don't know, but this guy, he has failed to kill a lot of people in the past. So maybe he used the razor to make sure he finished the job this time because he slit their throats with it. He also ransacked the house and appears to have taken $50, but left other cash and valuables behind. And so this is the first time where no survivors were left behind. He tended to leave the wives alone for the most part in the past, right? But not this time. Catherine Maggio gets the axe too, literally. And then we have a few red herrings. We have some attacks that seemed like the Axeman that actually weren't the Axeman, which of course derailed the investigations even further. About a month after the Maggios were killed, a Polish grocery store owner, so not Italian, Polish, named Louis Bessemer and his common law wife or mistress or housekeeper or something, this lady he was shacking up with named Harriet Lowe, were both attacked with a short-handled axe. But the attacks on Harriet were much, much worse than what Louis sustained. And it later came out, once Harriet regained her senses somewhat about 5 weeks later, that it was actually Louis who had attacked her. The head wound she sustained failed to heal, and she eventually died from this attack, weeks and weeks later, and just after naming Louis as the attacker. So initially, for the first few weeks, this was thought to be another Axeman attack, attacking both of them, but it later came out that it was actually just Louis Bessemer, probably trying to get away with killing Harriet for whatever reason by looking like the Axeman. So this is what you would call a copycat murder situation. On August 4th, 1918, a young mother of three named Mary Schneider, who was currently expecting her fourth child, was hit while she slept, but not with an axe. She was hit with a lamp from her bedside table. The house was ransacked and hundreds of dollars and a bunch of stuff, including an axe, had been stolen. So people were quick to assume that this was the Axeman, mostly because an axe had been stolen. But Mary Schneider was hit with a lamp, not an axe. And that's enough of a deviation from the Axeman's MO to convince most that this was not the Axeman. Just some burglar who broke into Mary Schneider's house. Also, she wasn't an Italian grocer, so that didn't fit either. You will be happy to know that she survived the attack with a lamp and successfully delivered her baby girl, whom she named Clara. But less than a week after this red herring attack on Mary Schneider, the actual Axeman seems to have struck again. An Italian barber this time, named Joe Romano, was beaten to death with an axe while he slept, which was found bloodied beside the bed. And you may be thinking, barber? I thought the Axeman only attacked grocers. Well, turns out Joe Romano's niece operated a small grocery store at the front of the house where he lived. So he himself was not a grocer, but he did live in a building that also housed an Italian grocery store. Close enough. Kenan Shahin writes, quote, "Two neighbors later told police that in the weeks prior, attempted intruders had been chased away from their homes in the night, both times dropping an axe as they ran. Several other sightings of men attempting to break in near previous Axeman crime scenes came forward. In the weeks after Romano's death, 3 other Italians, all grocers, were robbed, though not attacked, in a manner in line with the Axeman's methods, end quote. How many Italian grocers were there in New Orleans in 1918? Good Lord. Actually, according to Miriam Davis, by 1920, Italian immigrants ran around half of the grocery stores in New Orleans. So this is like a whole thing. Also, by 1900, New Orleans had the largest Italian immigrant population in the South at around 20,000. And this is probably a good time to pause and fill you in on that context a little more, Italian immigrants in New Orleans. According to Davis, these Italian immigrants made their way to New Orleans at a welcome time. This was right after the end of slavery, late 1800s, second half of the 1800s, and plantation owners were looking for cheap labor. Turns out, Italian immigrants made great cheap laborers. They worked hard and they didn't mind minimal pay. One planter called them, quote, a hard-working, money-saving race and content with few of the comforts of life. But the problem with Italian immigrants as plantation workers was that they didn't stay there long. They saved all the money that they made and they used it to climb the ladder out of that life very quickly. Davis says in that Smithsonian Magazine article, quote, as far as the planters were concerned, this was the one problem with Italian workers. Planters grumbled that they couldn't keep Italians in the field because in a couple of years they would have, quote within a quote, laid by a little money and are ready to start a fruit shop or grocery store at some crossroads town. By 1900, small Italian-owned businesses had sprung up all over Louisiana, end quote. So the sort of formula was immigrate to Louisiana, work on a plantation, saving all of the measly earnings you made, invest that money into a fruit cart sort of thing, save that money, invest that money in a corner grocery store. So many of them were doing this, and that's why there were so many Italian grocers. After the attack on Joe Romano, an Italian detective named D'Antonia comes forward with the theory that the Axeman is really just the cleaver, but that he took like this 6-year break. He said, quote, I am convinced the man is of a dual personality, and it is very probable he is the man we tried so hard to get 10 years ago, when a series of axe and butcher knife murders was committed within a few months. My opinion is based on experience and a study of criminology. So he thinks this guy is living sort of a double life, like he may just be some normal guy by day, Axeman by night. He compares him to Jack the Ripper, who operated in London only around 30 years before the Axeman was doing his thing in New Orleans. Jack the Ripper was still fresh at that time and still unsolved. So the Axeman is sort of a New Orleans version of Jack the Ripper. D'Antonia throws this theory out, but everyone is like, nah, you're crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. And I think part of this hesitancy to believe that they were the same guy was because witnesses had claimed that the cleaver was a white man. Remember, a clean-shaven white man. But the detective working the case at the New Orleans Police Department, the Axeman case now, was convinced that the Axeman was a black man. I don't know why. I can't find any witness accounts or anything saying that he was a black man. I have to assume, this is 1918. I have to assume there is some racial bias here, but I really don't know why Detective Mooney was so sure the guy was black. I can only speculate. On August 16th, the Times-Picayune newspaper actually even published a joke making fun of the floundering investigation, writing, quote, if this Axeman proves to be a Negro, I guess the head writers will call it an ebony mafia, end quote. As if to say, how did we go from Italian mafia with the whole black hand thing, that theory, to white guy to black guy? That's literally out of nowhere. What does this have anything to do with black guys? And it's yet another thing that keeps them from connecting the cleaver attacks to the Axeman attacks. It can't be the cleaver. He was white. Our guy's black for whatever reason. I don't know why he thinks that. The night of March 10th, 1919, marks the most horrific of all the attacks, the one that really scares the life out of people. Italian grocery store owners Charlie and Rosie Cortimiglia and their 2-year-old daughter Mary were found bludgeoned with an axe in their bed. The house was ransacked, but nothing was taken, and 2 axes were found on the property, and one of them was covered in blood and hair. Now, Rosie, the mother, was the only survivor of these attacks. And at first, when questioned, Rosie denied having seen the attacker at all. But police were pretty desperate at this point. I mean, a 2-year-old girl had been murdered, and so they resorted to some pretty desperate measures. When Rosie got out of the hospital, having just lost her husband and child and having been brutally attacked herself and hospitalized, when she got out of the hospital, the police threw her in jail. Yeah, they made her spend the night in jail until she confessed who attacked her. So less than 24 hours after she said that she didn't see the attacker, she signed a document saying that it was her neighbors, Irlando and Frank Giordano. The Giordanos were arrested for this and kept in jail for an entire year before Rosie, racked with guilt, confessed to the Times-Picayune newspaper that she had wrongfully accused them of this, and that she had been sort of forced or coerced to sign this paper saying that they had done it. The paper wrote, quote, "A little more than a week ago, Mrs. Cortimiglia came to the offices of the Times-Picayune and in the presence of several members of the staff voluntarily confessed that she had falsely identified the convicted men at the trial. She declared that she was mentally unbalanced at the time of the trial and wished to withdraw her testimony against the Giordanos." End quote. You think? So soon after the attacks on the Cortimiglia family, a mysterious letter appears in that newspaper, the Times-Picayune, that is apparently from the Axeman himself. March 16th, 1919, the paper published this letter that it had been sent by the Axeman, right? It reads, and I'm going to read the whole thing to you because I think it's really important. The letter reads, quote, "Hell, March 13th, 1919. Editor of the Times-Picayune, New Orleans. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a fell demon from hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come again and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with the blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way in which they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid so as to amuse not only me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they never were born than for them to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure that your police will always dodge me as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you, Orleanians, think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished to, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 o'clock earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to the people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose house a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much the better for the people. One thing is certain, and that is some of those persons who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and as it is about the time that I have left your homely earth, I will cease my discourse. hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or the realm of fancy. Signed, the Axeman. End quote. Okay. So my initial reaction is that this is a joke. This demon from hell is fond of jazz. He says persons who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, jazz it. And then he's like, okay, well, I'm cold and I want to go home. So bye. It's borderline comical. And this was taken very seriously, though, at the time. People were scared. I mean, a 2-year-old girl had been bludgeoned to death with an axe, and so they took this letter very seriously. Kenan Shahin writes, quote, late into the night on March 18th, 1919, and early the morning after, jazz floated into the damp, dark air from houses and bars across New Orleans and its suburbs. Normally, such an outpouring of music is and was a product of celebration, but on this particular spring night, the sound signaled something much more sinister. New Orleanians were playing jazz music out of fear for their lives, end quote. But most experts, including Miriam Davis, do not believe the letter was written by the Axeman at all. They think the whole thing was a hoax. Davis says, quote, when you read the letter, this is a person who's an educated person. He has a classical allusion to Tartarus, a place of torment in Greek mythology. It reads like it was written by a fraternity or something. And the person who is the Axeman, from the description we've got of him, he's a working man. He's working class. And I just don't think a working class person at that time would have been educated enough to write that letter, end quote. It's like the Shakespeare conundrum all over again, right? If you listened to that episode I did a couple weeks ago. In her book, Davis details speaking with both a modern homicide detective and a Georgia Bureau of Investigation's criminal profiler, and both agree that the letter was not written by the actual Axeman. So who wrote it and why? A lot of people think the letter was written by a New Orleans jazz musician named Joseph John Davila. You see, Davila wrote a jazz song that night, the night of March 19th, the night of the jazz, that he called the Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa. And he claimed to have finished this song around 2 a.m. once he was sure that the Axeman wasn't coming to get him. He's playing jazz music because the letter said to play jazz music, right? So that you don't get killed and all that. But then he sort of uses this story behind this new song to get publicity. So there are some who think it was actually Davila who sent the letter to the newspaper pretending to be the Axeman as a way of getting attention to his jazz music, like it was a publicity stunt. On March 19th, the Times-Picayune published a cartoon of sorts, think like political cartoon style, showing a family playing jazz music in this sort of frantic, frenzy way while staring out of the door, terrified, looking for the Axeman. And Davila would later use this same cartoon as the cover of the sheet music for his new song, which you are seeing right now if you're watching this episode on YouTube or Patreon. So it's fishy. This guy's fishy. He could potentially have been the letter writer. This could have just been some very off-kilter publicity stunt. Another nearby newspaper called the West Bank Herald criticized the Times-Picayune for even publishing the obviously fake letter, writing on March 20th, quote, it is very evident that the man who wrote this letter is one with more than ordinary intelligence, and it can readily be seen that it is written more as a joke than anything else. In fact, it looks to us that someone put one over on the Times-Picayune. Undoubtedly, the letter made good Sunday reading for those who like to read articles of a sensational character, but we must stop to think of the great amount of harm it has done to the ignorant classes, who are superstitiously inclined and believe to a certain extent that this Axeman would visit certain families who did not have a jazz band. If the TP would have devoted the same amount of space in an effort to capture the man who is causing these murders, it would have served the public to a much greater advantage than the publishing of this joke letter, which caused a great deal of uneasiness and worry among the ignorant classes. So satisfied was the TP with this scoop that it gloated over it Wednesday morning by publishing a cartoon showing one of the many families in a state of fright, the mother piteously trying to soothe the children by playing jazz music in compliance with the order of the Axeman. We fail to see the joke, end quote. Same. The Axeman did not actually attack anyone on the night of the jazz music. And actually, there were no more attacks, in New Orleans at least, after the Cortimiglia family on March 10th, 1919. That was it. But these guys don't just stop, right? If a serial killer stops killing, it means something has happened. He's either been jailed for something else, he's been killed himself, or he's moved out of the area. Miriam Davis thinks the latter is the case here, that the Axeman left New Orleans but continued killing. She writes, quote, "Evidence from police records and newspaper accounts, however, show that he struck elsewhere in Louisiana, killing Joseph Sparrow and his daughter in Alexandria in December 1920, Giovanni Orlando in DeRidder in January 1921, and Frank Scalisi in Lake Charles in April 1921. The killer's modus operandus was the same, breaking into an Italian grocery in the middle of the night and attacking the grocer and his family with their own axe. The Axeman then disappeared from history," end quote. So who was this guy? There are theories, none of them very good. There was that farmer guy, that Sam Pizzo guy, who was threatening Italian grocers, but he wasn't white enough, so they never really looked into him. There was a guy named Joseph Mumfree who had been arrested in 1907 for attempting to bomb an Italian grocery store. So this would have been 1907. This would have been before all the attacks, right? Even before the Cleaver attack. So I assume that he was out by 1910 when the Cleaver first struck, or we wouldn't be suspecting him at all. This theory really gets some teeth when another Italian grocer named Mark Pepitone was beaten to death in his sleep with an iron bar in New Orleans in October of 1919. So that's 7 months after the last official Axeman attack, and it's an iron bar, not an axe. So probably not the Axeman. Davis thinks that this was just an unrelated vendetta and that he happened to be an Italian grocer. Anyway, Pepitone's widow, a woman named Esther, she gets remarried to a guy named Angelo who works with Joseph Mumfree. Esther and Angelo end up moving to Los Angeles with Mumfree, and then Angelo disappears mysteriously without a trace. Soon after that, according to Esther, Mumfree walked into her house and demanded that she give him $500 or he would, quote, "kill her like I did your husband." And I actually love the way that this story ends. So Esther goes back into the bedroom, like she's getting him the money, the $500 that he asked for. But really, she gets a revolver. She comes back out shooting. She ends up shooting Mumfree 11 times, killing him. But, to me, there's very little connection to the Axeman here. Mumfree said he killed her husband. Is he talking about Angelo or Pepitone? Probably Angelo, the one we know he actually knew and worked with. Some weird coincidences for sure, though. Mumfree kills the husband of a woman who used to be married to an Italian grocer in New Orleans who was bludgeoned to death, and Mumfree once got arrested for trying to bomb an Italian grocery store. It's weird, but it's not great proof that Mumfree was the Axeman. It's more just proof that there were a lot of Italian grocers in New Orleans carrying out various vendettas against each other. Davis agrees, saying, quote, "It was funny how that story got twisted in the retelling from the Los Angeles police to the New Orleans police to the New Orleans reporters. Again, like a game of telephone. And it led to Mumfree being assumed by many to be the Axeman, and it's easy to see how it happened," end quote. Girl stealing my telephone analogy. I'll allow it. It's a good one. So to this day, we have no idea who the New Orleans Axeman serial killer was. No idea. And I think that's kind of wild considering how many witnesses he left behind. There were a lot of survivors of these attacks. Mary Davy said he was a clean-shaven white man, which means she saw his face, right? To know that he was even clean-shaven. I'm astounded that with so many eyewitnesses, they never managed to catch this guy. But I think a lot of mistakes and just like mishaps led to this case being mishandled by the New Orleans police. For one, the main detective handling the Cleaver cases from years earlier was murdered. And then the new detective was convinced for some reason that the Axeman was not only not the Cleaver, but also a black man, which I can find no witness testimony to support. I have all kinds of speculative theories on that have to do with the letter published in the newspaper about the Axeman loving jazz and jazz being performed by mostly black musicians at the time, and jazz music carrying this weird evil connotation for mostly conservative white folks in those days. But then modern experts and criminal profilers swear that joke letter wasn't even written by the Axeman, and even the guy we think wrote it, the Davila guy, he wasn't black either. So I think that the Detective Mooney, just really went down the wrong rabbit hole, probably fueled by racial prejudice of the day. And then it's like, what in the heck with the Italian grocery stores? Why were they such a target? Was this like a fellow grocer just trying to take out all the other grocery stores in town so he would get all the business? I'd be taking a look at the other grocers for sure. Who else has that weird and specific of a motive? Just like someone who hates Italian grocers? But then on the other hand, who would hate Italian grocers? Probably not another Italian grocer. Possibly someone upset about Italian immigrants climbing that ladder up from field hand to grocer. There was a lot of hateful racism toward Italian immigrants in those days. You know, despite hailing from Europe, they were not seen as white people. They were not on the same social level as white people. According to Davis, quote, "The commercial success of Sicilian immigrants couldn't protect them from the racial prejudices of the American South. Italians never entirely replaced black labor in Louisiana, but worked alongside African Americans in the fields. While Italians, not understanding the racial hierarchies of the South, found nothing shameful about this, for native whites, their willingness to do so made them no better than, quote, Negroes, Chinese, or other, quote, non-white groups. The swarthy Sicilians were often considered not white at all, nothing but black Dagos," end quote. She also says, quote, "In 1929, a New Orleans judge expressed a common view of most Sicilians in New Orleans as, quote, of a thoroughly undesirable character, being largely composed of the most vicious, ignorant, degraded, and filthy paupers, with something more than an admixture of the criminal element," end quote. So if this guy was a clean-shaven white man, as Mary Davy had insisted, then it's possible he was carrying out his own vendetta against Italian immigrants because of these racial prejudices at the time. And how can you be sure someone is an Italian immigrant and not just like a tan white guy or a light-skinned black guy? Well, he owns an Italian grocery store. It's a dead giveaway. Davis thinks the story of the Axeman has been blown up to almost mythic proportions because of what she calls the glamour associating a killer with jazz music. There's like this glamorous element of combining those two things. She says, quote, "I'm not sure what deeper truth a killer who likes jazz reflects, but it's just the kind of thing people remember," end quote. If New Orleans is known for anything, it's jazz and murder, and maybe like jambalaya. But jazz and murder, they combine together in this story in a way that sticks with you, all culminating with this frenzied, discordant night of music, so antithetical to murder, and yet happening simultaneously. There's something very alluring there. We are no closer to figuring out who the Axeman of New Orleans was now than we were then, but his story isn't going anywhere. And in it, we see a glimpse of how legends are made. Because the real Axeman was likely no more a jazz enthusiast than he was a demon from hell. But we like the idea of it. Something about it sticks with us. And out of it comes not the New Orleans Axeman cold case murder story, but the New Orleans Axeman, the legend. It's a fine line we walk with history. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram at History Fix Podcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from The Axeman of New Orleans, The True Story by Miriam Davis, Smithsonian Magazine, the Historic New Orleans Collections, Country Road Magazine, and Wikipedia. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.